Welcome to Lesson 4. Today we're going to look at a few different things. We're going to look at statistics of poverty. What are some of the causes of poverty? And why poverty look different in some places than others? We're also going to concentrate on the Nile River. Is it important? Why is it important? We're also going to look at different seasons in different parts of the world. We're going to discuss terms like arid and semi-arid. So we're going to take a little bit of a different focus today, and I hope you enjoy it. Now, across East Africa, poverty looks around between the 36 to 50% of each population. What does poverty actually mean? What do we mean when we say people live in poverty? Well, we are told that those who live on $2 a day and less are considered those in poverty. But poverty in your country could be different than mine. Homelessness in your country could be different to mine. You see, in your country, if you are unemployed, you don't have anywhere to live, you're a student, maybe you're a single parent, you can go to your government and ask for financial assistance, which is really, really good. In developing countries, there's no such thing as financial assistance in this measure. Not at all. So as we've talked about, you have to pay to go to school. If you don't work, you don't eat. Poverty can come about because of many causes, and we're going to discuss those. Lack of shelter. If you don't have anywhere to live, it means you don't have any belongings. Where are your children going to go? You can be exposed to the elements of the hot sun, the rain, the storms, but also you can be very vulnerable for people to abuse you. Water sources and the resources around that, and we're going to discuss a lot of that today. If you don't have access to water, you can't bathe. Now we know that you can't survive without water, even just drinking. What if that water is not clean though? So you've got to think of all these things around water. It's not just that we can't access water out of a tap, it's having to go and physically get it. So what does that do to your body when you're carrying 20 litres of water for a long time? What if the only water you can get is not clean? It has waterborne diseases and it has ongoing effects. Food insecurity. Now, I understand in your country that you can just go to a supermarket and grab things. There might not be something that you really like, your favourite brand or everything all the time, but you know you can get the basics. But food insecurity is caused by things like lack of transport, war, or civil unrest, so trucks can't get through. Food insecurity can also come about because of different seasons. So if there's a drought for many, many years and you don't have a water supply, the crops won't grow. If there are floods, you can have your topsoil washed away. Or if there are windstorms, you can have that soil blown away. There's some really good documentaries about in America how they have had in the past huge windstorms that have come through for many, many years. Look it up. It's fascinating, and how, because people did too much farming, not enough irrigation, not enough good plants to go in there, going away from native plants, washed all the soil away simply because of dust storms. Very fascinating. We've already talked about good quality healthcare. The problem is, what if you can't afford or don't have access to that healthcare? Here's a prime example. There is a thing that women can suffer from after childbirth called fistula. Fistula basically means a hole. So for some women, they have prolonged labour. It can go long, like for days and days and days. Now, in the Western world, in your developed countries, you would naturally just go to a hospital, have a cesarean section, and out would come baby. But in East Africa, it's very, very expensive, and also you might be days and days away from a hospital, so women will give birth at home. And a fistula causes a hole, so most of the time babies die. Sometimes the women also die, but if they don't, they're left with a fistula, which is a hole. There's a description there about it. And to get to good healthcare can be really, really tricky, because it's embarrassing. The urine and feces just freely flow, you smell, and of course if you don't have water, you can't wash. So all these causes of poverty work together. And there's an amazing woman called Dr. Hamlin who works in Ethiopia, and her and her husband started a special fistula hospital.
To think it's going on when we've got so much in medicine, and we can't save women in labour. You can't help being upset to see a beautiful woman, dying for nothing. He was the superintendent of a big hospital in Sydney, and I was working there as an intern. We went to a hotel and had a meal together. So that's when I first started to go out with him. And then we got married after about 6 months. We answered an advertisement in the Lancet Medical Journal, which is a very prestigious English medical journal, and it said, Ethiopia wants a doctor, a gynecologist for Addis Ababa, and to train midwives. We wanted to go somewhere where we could do some good for somebody without enough doctors, some country. We saw this one, and we said, well, why don't we apply for this? We were in the army hospital, and we used to get the frozen plasma from the Red Cross in Sydney. We had no blood bank in the country, so we'd get a woman might come in there bleeding to death, and we had nothing to give her. So this plasma was life-saving. We started the hospital in 1974, and when we first opened, we had just simple beds, and just staff doing around, Reg just talking to a patient. I would just hug them and try to say a few words in Amharic to them, and Reg would do a great scene. Oh, he used to tell them what was going to happen when they're cured, that they were going to go to their village and people would be looking out from their homes and saying, who's this beautiful girl coming up the hill? And then find out that it's their daughter coming back cured. They loved him. I don't know what I love about Ethiopia, but I love the people, and I love the scenery, and I love the simplicity of life here. I'd like to see our hospital turn into a maternity hospital. I won't see it, I'm afraid, but we could eradicate fistulas if we had enough doctors. The government's given us 3 rooms out of every health centre that they set up. And also, we've got our fistula centres working hard in the countryside. Our midwives now are doing good work. They're really making a difference. We have to get rid of this fistula.
Now I want to talk about some geographical things. So we know that we're focusing on East Africa, but I want to talk a little bit about rainfall. See, we only get rain usually a couple of times a year, but generally we live in what's called an arid place in the world. Arid means that there's very little rain or not enough to support vegetation. Semi-arid means that there's just a little bit more than that. And East Africa generally is semi-arid. So one of the questions I have for you, I'm going to put one in here now, is what is the average rainfall where you are per year? I want you to go and have a look at that. So here's another question for you. Out of these 3 rivers, which one is the longest in the world? Is it the Amazon, the Nile, or the Yangtze? So the Nile is just 6,500 kilometres in length. So let's have a look. There's that, 6,650 to be exact. The Amazon is 6,400, and the Yangtze River is 6,300. So there's not a lot of difference in kilometres between those. So how does that compare with a river, say, in New Zealand or Australia? Well, in New Zealand, the Waikato River is only 425 kilometres long. But in Australia, the Murray River is 2,500 kilometres long. So they are much shorter than the Nile. And we're going to look at the Nile right now. There's been controversy for many years about where the Nile River actually started. And as you can see, it actually starts at this tiny little stream in Burundi, which is in East Africa. It goes through Lake Victoria and all the way up to the Mediterranean. Now I want to tell you about some Kiwis and some British people that spent 5 months travelling through the Nile to see, number one, which direction it actually goes. So it goes up. And some of the things like measuring the exact amount. So there's a great book you can read called Ascend the Nile. And this is the story of the guys who travelled the Nile. Now, there's many people who have done it. This was done in 2006, and here's one of the guys, and he tells about the adventure.
We came here in 1996, and we did a first descent of the river. So in other words, nobody had ever rafted or ever been down this river before. So we were very excited about it. And because it's the Nile, I'd heard stories since I was very small about this river. And so the idea of coming here and rafting down these rapids was very exciting. Since a child, I've always been fascinated by the Nile. I saw the stories of the ancient Egyptians and the irrigation canals and read about the history of the river. And then when I came here to the other end of the river, it was very exciting for me. And I thought that I needed to live a childhood dream, really, and that's to travel the length of the river. But historically it was always explored from the coast. So we started in Egypt, we started in the Mediterranean, and we travelled up the Nile for over 80 days, 6,718 kilometres. And we measured the river for the first time ever from the river. And so at the end of that expedition, the source of the Nile, Ascend the Nile expedition in 2006, we were able to come out and say, well, actually the Nile is 107 kilometres longer than what anybody ever thought. Because the only way they've ever been able to measure it before was to lay a piece of string along a map and to measure the piece of string. But because we travelled the entire length, we could use modern GPS technology and measure it very accurately. There were many, many challenges, but certainly the most difficult was when we were attacked by the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, and my friend Steve was killed. That was a very, very difficult time for us. The Lord's Resistance Army really had no sort of agenda. It was basically a robbery, but they just opened fire on our vehicle with no warning, and they took cash and a battery and a few clothing items. They cut the seat belt out of the car, but they have a reputation for not leaving people alive, and we were very lucky. We're very lucky to be here. So I think what's incredible to me about the Nile is that all this water travels such a great length to support Egypt. And you know, as the famous saying goes, Egypt is nothing without the Nile. And so I think that's the most amazing thing, the fact that you've got these desert areas and all these semi-desert areas that are watered by the river and by the water from here. The river itself is it's one of the arteries of the planet. You know, the Nile brings life, not just to us and to the ancient Egyptian civilization and to the modern Egyptian civilization, but you look around you, the thousands of bird species, all the huge populations of animal. It keeps this part of Africa, and everywhere it travels it keeps it alive. So it's a river of life.
So it's not easy. It sounds adventurous, travelling on these boats, trying to figure out how long the Nile is, but it was a great book. You should read it. I've travelled on the Nile in two places, in Cairo in Egypt and also near Jinja in Uganda, and whitewater rafting on the Nile is an adventure.
Forward and go left. Harder. Stop. Forward hard. And forward. Stop and get down. Natalie! Where are you?
Right now there is a lot of conflict about who owns the water in the Nile. Check that out, do some news stories and have a look at it. Just because it's a river, it's actually who does the water belong to, and that can be issues in many countries. Who does the water belong to? There can be controversy about land ownership, about water rights, who is selling the water to whom, and it's a whole different area I want you to have a look at about water rights.